Oral questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by sending best wishes to the Prime Minister and his children that are dealing with COVID-19. As a family that had COVID in the home, I wish them a speedy recovery. Canadian manufacturers, the Federation of Independent Business, the Chamber of Commerce, the Conservative Opposition, thousands of truckers for over a month have proposed solutions to the trucking shortage in Canada and the supply chain crisis, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has ignored this crisis, and even worse, he calls names for people that are raising these very issues. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is simple. Will the Prime Minister move past the division and agree to meet with some of the truckers impacted by his federal regulations?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the science is very clear. The best way through this pandemic is to get people vaccinated. That's how we end the disruptions to our supply chains caused by this global pandemic. That's how we get back to the things we love to do. That's why we've been unequivocal on the need to get vaccinated. And great news, Canadians across the country stepped up. Almost 90% of Canadians are vaccinated, including almost 90% of truckers, because we know that the biggest disruption to our supply chains happens when people catch COVID. That's why vaccinations are the way through it, and we're going to continue to be unequivocal about that.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when you ignore and divide a country when it needs to be united, that's not leadership, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that the voices of a few don't represent the millions of Canadians who are worried. Millions of Canadians over 2 years have seen their lives upended, their children's mental health impacted, businesses fail, Mr. Speaker, the nation being stretched in our social fabric. Vaccines are critically important, but as the Prime Minister's own COVID diagnosis demonstrates after 3 vaccinations, we have to use all tools, Mr. Speaker, to get our life back to normal. When is life getting back to normal, Mr. Speaker?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I know, and all Canadians know, how frustrating it is to have to deal with this pandemic for now 2 years and ongoing. But Canadians also have never been so united in stepping up. Almost 90% of Canadians have been vaccinated. And that means they are protecting our frontline health workers. They are making sure that we're getting through this as best we possibly can. It is that unity of Canadians, that nature that we have of being there for each other that has been on such display through this pandemic. Yes, there are people who are still hesitant, and yes, there are people...
Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, depuis plus d'1 mois, le Conseil de manufacturiers, la Chambre de commerce, l'opposition conservatrice et des milliers de Canadiens ont demandé des politiques plus justes pour régler le problème de la pénurie des camionneurs et la chaîne d'approvisionnement. La pandémie a changé après 2 ans, Monsieur le Président, avec les vaccins, les tests de dépistage rapide et les autres outils. Qu'attend le Premier ministre pour utiliser tous les outils nécessaires pour qu'on puisse retrouver une vie normale?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
On est tous d'accord qu'on veut en finir avec la COVID. On est tous épuisés de la COVID-19. C'est pour ça qu'on utilise le meilleur outil qu'on a, c'est-à-dire les vaccinations. C'est pour ça qu'on est sans équivoque que les gens doivent se faire vacciner pour se protéger, pour protéger nos travailleurs de santé, pour ramener l'économie et les chaînes d'approvisionnement là où ils doivent être. On utilise aussi les autres outils, mais les meilleurs outils sont les vaccins et c'est ça qu'on est en train de privilégier, contrairement au Parti conservateur.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Ukraine is an important friend and ally to Canada. Our friends in Ukraine are facing the risk of a Russian invasion as Russian troops gather at their border. Ukrainians have seen this story before, Mr. Speaker, in Crimea. Other NATO allies are delivering the military aid that Ukraine is requesting to help defend themselves. Why won't this Liberal government answer the call from our friends in Ukraine?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Minister.
That's exactly what we've done in standing up for Ukraine unequivocally, not just right now, but have been for the past many years. In my numerous conversations with President Zelensky, in the engagements that our ministers have had in the region, we have been listening to Ukraine in terms of what they most need. Obviously, we need to continue the extraordinary trading mission that Canadians have been part of for many, many years, and even increase it. And also, we continue to deliver the aid, whether it's monetary or military, that they need.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, l'Ukraine est l'une des amies et alliés importants du Canada. Nos amis ukrainiens sont confrontés au risque d'une invasion russe à leurs frontières. D'autres alliés de l'OTAN fournissent l'aide militaire demandée par l'Ukraine. On doit aider l'Ukraine pour éviter le même scénario de la Crimée. Pourquoi le gouvernement libéral ne répond pas aux demandes de l'Ukraine?
Honorable Premier ministre.
Au contraire, Monsieur le Président, nous répondons aux demandes de nos amis ukrainiens. Nous allons toujours être avec eux contre l'agression russe. C'est pour ça que nous avions prolongé et agrandi la mission unifiée qui sert à former les troupes ukrainiennes. C'est pour ça qu'on a envoyé 120 millions de dollars en aide et soutien économique. C'est pour ça qu'on aide de bien différentes façons, comme demandé par le président Zelensky et d'autres dans nos échanges fréquents.
L'honorable député de la Prairie.
Président, vous pourrez faire par exprès pour ne pas voir que les choses dégénèrent. Le centre-ville d'Ottawa est paralysé, les ponts sont fermés, les députés qui sont élus par des millions de personnes ne peuvent difficilement avoir accès au Parlement. Il y a des milliers de gens, des camionneurs surtout, mais aussi d'autres personnes avec d'autres préoccupations qui manifestent contre des mesures. On a un problème, Monsieur le Président, c'est que ces mesures qu'il dénonce sont les mesures à utiliser pour sortir définitivement de la pandémie. On appelle ça, Monsieur le Président, une impasse. Et on n'a pas les moyens de se payer une impasse comme ça ces temps-ci. Qu'est-ce que le gouvernement va faire pour sortir de cette crise?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Nous allons évidemment toujours défendre la liberté de manifester, de s'exprimer en désaccord avec des politiques gouvernementales, mais nous allons aussi être très ferme contre la violence, contre la haine, contre l'intolérance que malheureusement on a aussi vu dans cette manifestation. Les services policiers sont là pour assurer la protection des gens dans la mesure du possible, mais ce dont on a besoin, c'est que les gens rentrent chez eux. Leur message est passé. Nous allons continuer de passer les vaccinations, d'utiliser les vaccinations pour aider les gens.
L'honorable député de la Prairie.
Monsieur le Président, il n'y a pas juste les manifestants qui sont à bout. Les gens, en général, sont à bout. Le personnel de la santé est à bout de souffle. Les gens qui se sont retrouvés seuls, encore une fois, dans le temps des fêtes, est à bout, Monsieur le Président. Les secteurs de notre économie qui ne voient pas la fin sont à bout aussi. Les gens sont tannés de ça, Monsieur le Président. On comprend qu'il y a de la colère, de la frustration. On le constate et tout le monde sait que la haine n'est pas la solution. Mais ça ne nous avance pas, tout ça. Qu'est-ce que le gouvernement va concrètement faire pour sortir de cette crise?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
On va continuer de faire ce qu'on fait depuis le début. D'être là pour soutenir les Canadiens avec tout ce que ça prend pendant aussi longtemps que ça prend, à procurer des vaccins, à être là avec des tests rapides, pour envoyer des milliards de dollars aux provinces pour aider avec les systèmes de santé, pour donner des appuis aux travailleurs, aux aînés, aux familles qui en ont besoin. Ce gouvernement était là avec 8 $ sur 10 de toute l'aide envoyée aux Canadiens pendant cette pandémie et on va continuer d'être là avec les solutions, principalement avec des vaccins pour passer à travers.
Honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We saw some really hateful and disturbing images coming out of the convoy in Ottawa this past weekend. We saw the Nazi flag being flown, the Confederate flag being flown, and instead of denouncing and making it clear that this type of hate has no place in Canada, the leader of the official opposition and his Conservative MPs left the door open to this type of hate in Canada. What is the Prime Minister going to do to tackle the rise of online hate so we can build a better future for our kids?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I thank the leader of the NDP for bringing up this important issue. Obviously, like him, we vigorously condemn the hatred, the intolerance that we've seen in the streets of Ottawa over the past number of days. We know all Canadians are frustrated, all Canadians are tired of this pandemic, but the vast majority of Canadians know that listening to science, getting vaccinated, continuing to be there for each other with respect and openness is the best and really only way through this pandemic. That's what we'll stay focused on.
Honourable member for Burnaby South.
On a vu des images haineuses sortant du convoi cette fin de semaine. Et au lieu de les dénoncer, le chef de l'opposition officielle et ses députés conservateurs ont laissé la porte ouverte à cette sorte de haine. Le Premier ministre, que ferait-il pour faire face à la montée de la haine sur les niveaux, sur les réseaux sociaux, pour bâtir un meilleur avenir pour nos enfants?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Le gouvernement va rester solidaire avec la vaste majorité des Canadiens qui ont fait des sacrifices, qui sont tannés de la COVID-19, bien sûr, mais continuent de se respecter les uns les autres et d'être là les uns pour les autres, pour les travailleurs de santé, pour ceux qui font des services essentiels. C'est ces gens-là qui nous montrent la voie, comment on va passer à travers cette pandémie, et c'est sur eux que nous allons nous concentrer. Le Parti conservateur a des réflexions sur comment il démontre du leadership irresponsable ces jours-ci.
Honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the government of Ukraine has requested lethal defensive weapons from this government. Many of our allies, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the Czech Republic, all have granted this request and have supplied lethal defensive weapons. The Prime Minister has refused this request. Why?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was in Ukraine a week ago, President Zelensky made one ask: to make sure that we would help by offering a sovereign loan to the Ukraine government to make sure to deal with economic instability. 3 days later, we provided $120 million in sovereign loan. What I heard from the National Guard on site in Ukraine is they needed more support in terms of military training. A week later, we extended and expanded Operation Unifier.
The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, diplomacy not backed by credible threats of the use of military force is nothing more than empty talk and rhetoric. Canada should be joining our other democratic allies and working in a multilateral fashion with our NATO partners to grant Ukraine's request and provide lethal defensive weapons. When will this government quit being so naive about its foreign policy and ensure that it counters the threats coming from authoritarian regimes like Russia?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're steadfast in supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Let me quote NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. Canada is one of the lead countries in NATO when it comes to providing support for Ukraine. He also said there are not many countries at equal level of efforts doing as much as Canada. We'll continue to work with our NATO allies and make sure that the situation de-escalates.
L'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, les événements qui ont cours actuellement à la frontière entre la Russie et l'Ukraine préoccupent tous les Canadiens qui ont à cœur la paix dans le monde. Malheureusement, Monsieur le Président, le Canada voit sa réputation ternie. Aujourd'hui, dans le journal de la presse, un diplomate en poste à l'étranger n'y va pas de même ordre quand il parle de l'action du gouvernement canadien. Je cite, « Je qualifie l'approche actuelle de dilettantisme qui carbure à la complaisance. C'est un gros manque de sérieux. » Fin de la citation. Quand est-ce que le gouvernement canadien, quand est-ce que le premier ministre va prendre au sérieux la situation tragique qui se vit actuellement en Ukraine?
Honorable ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Écoutez, on n'a pas de leçon à recevoir des conservateurs et au contraire, on espère avoir l'appui de toute la Chambre pour qu'est-ce qui se passe présentement en Ukraine. On doit envoyer un message fort à la Russie. La Russie, présentement, est l'agresseur et nous sommes solidaires par rapport au peuple ukrainien. Voilà pourquoi nous investissons énormément d'énergie dans tous les différents canaux canaux de diplomatie, que ce soit avec les États-Unis, que ce soit avec l'OTAN ou encore au sein du groupe Normandie avec l'Allemagne et également la France. Merci.
Honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Parole, Monsieur le Président. Ce que les Ukrainiens veulent, ce sont des actions concrètes et réelles. D'ailleurs, dans le journal La Presse, le diplomate qui est en poste actuellement à l'étranger au nom du Canada écrit, et je cite, « Le gouvernement mise davantage sur son soft power illusoire, une approche axée presque exclusivement sur l'image et les communications plutôt que sur le concret. On persiste à faire la morale à tous en vantant nos valeurs canadiennes ad nauseam et en se rabattant sur la diplomatie du communiqué de presse. Monsieur le Président, les Ukrainiens veulent plus que des communiqués de presse et que les Ukrainiens veulent de l'action concrète, réelle et efficace de la part du Canada. Quand le premier ministre va prendre la crise au sérieux, oui ou non?
Honorable ministre.
Monsieur le Président, on n'a pas de leçons à recevoir de la part du Parti conservateur, particulièrement étant donné lorsqu'ils étaient au pouvoir, ils ont coupé massivement dans toutes les différentes missions partout à travers l'étranger. Et donc, dans les circonstances, nous prenons le leadership sur la question. Je suis allée en Ukraine il y a à peine une semaine. Ma collègue est là présentement, ministre de la Défense, et nous sommes là à travailler avec le gouvernement ukrainien. Et nous sommes là également en faisant en sorte de dire aux Russes, au gouvernement russe, que si jamais ils vont de l'avant avec une autre invasion de l'Ukraine, il y aura des conséquences sévères. Merci.
The honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. Speaker, the Russians are ready for war with Ukraine. They've moved over 100,000 troops surrounding Ukraine's borders. The Russians have moved blood supplies to their field hospitals. This government has pulled back our Op Unifier trainers west of the Dnieper River. Can the minister tell this Parliament if that means the government considers a diplomatic solution unlikely and a Russian invasion of Ukraine is now imminent?
Great question.
The honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Obviously, we take the threat of a further Russian invasion very seriously. And that's why there are two paths to stop Russia to further invade Ukraine. The first one is the diplomatic one. And that's why we're working with NATO, US, and Normandy format, which is France and Germany. But also, we're working on deterrence. That's why also we extended and expanded Operation Unifier, and also we have prepared an array of different economic sanctions against Russia should they further invade. Thank you.
The member for South Surrey, White Rocks.
Mr. Speaker, Ukraine will likely be the scene of a large conventional ground war. We have watched this Russian military buildup in Belarus, Russia, Donbass, and Crimea since the Russian Zapad exercises last September. The government had months to prepare a robust military aid package to Ukraine. When will the Minister of Defense provide the lethal weapons that Ukraine needs now?
The Honourable Minister.
As mentioned before, Mr. Speaker, we've already answered the call on the part of the Ukrainian government by expanding and extending Operation Unifier. I was there a week ago and met with the military, the Canadian Armed Forces on site, which comes from Valcartier right now, Quebec City. And I saw on the ground how much the National Guard is thankful to Canadians to make sure that we're providing the right support to the military and the National Guard. And we've trained more than 30,000 National Guards and armed forces in Ukraine since 2014. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Monsieur le Président, la population est épuisée de la COVID. Le variant Omicron, on l'a tous de travers. Mais c'est pas le temps de lâcher. C'est le temps de donner un grand coup pour sortir de la pandémie une fois pour toutes. On l'a vu avec Omicron, ça va pas finir tant qu'on n'aura pas vacciné la planète entière. Il n'y a pas de sortie de crise sans vaccination mondiale. Qu'est-ce que le gouvernement fait pour accélérer la vaccination à l'international pour qu'on n'ait plus jamais à passer l'hiver en confinement?
Honorable ministre de la Santé.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à mon collègue de soulever cette importante question. Il a tout à fait bien dit. Cette COVID ne se terminera pas nulle part tant qu'elle ne se termine pas partout sur la planète. Et c'est pour ça que le Canada, dès le départ, dès le début de la crise de la COVID-19, a été un des plus grands investigateurs, un des plus grands acteurs en matière de mettre sur place la procédure COVAX, qui nous a permis, dès le début, d'investir rapidement dans non seulement le développement, mais aussi la livraison et l'appui à la livraison de dizaines de millions de vaccins. Et c'est la bonne chose à faire.
Honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Monsieur le Président, la population, elle va chercher sa troisième dose. Sa part, elle l'a fait. Mais ce qu'elle veut entendre, c'est pas qu'on a assez de vaccins pour une éventuelle quatrième dose. Ce qu'on veut entendre, c'est que l'état de pandémie est terminé. Pour ça, il faut vacciner le monde entier. Il y a 2 semaines, j'entendais le gouvernement célébrer qu'il y avait 1 milliard de doses dans le programme COVAX. Mais il y a plus de 3 milliards de personnes dans le monde qui n'ont toujours pas eu leur première dose. Est-ce que le gouvernement comprend que les demi-mesures ne suffisent plus?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable colleague had mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic does not recognize borders and will only be overcome through a coordinated global action. And this is why Canada stepped up, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to donating the equivalent of at least 200 million COVID-19 vaccines. We are committed to supporting the equitable global access to COVID-19 vaccines. This includes therapeutics and diagnostics as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Monsieur le Président, c'est pas compliqué. Le temps est compté. Si 70 de la population mondiale n'est pas vaccinée d'ici 6 mois, on est à risque d'une nouvelle vague, de replonger dans une autre crise. Le temps presse, Monsieur le Président. Et le mois dernier, la vice-présidente au développement humain de la Banque mondiale confirmait, je cite, « À ce stade, il n'est pas évident que cet objectif sera atteint. » Monsieur le Président, la vaccination mondiale se dirige vers un échec. Qu'est-ce que le Canada fait aujourd'hui pour redresser ce navire-là, pour qu'on sorte enfin de la pandémie pour de bon? Et une réponse, s'il vous plaît.
Honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, as we stated, Canada is stepping up to provide vaccines for the global community. That's why our government committed $2.6 million in commitment to the COVID-19 response, which includes $1.3 billion for the ACT Accelerator, of which $545 million is for COVAX. Over $740 million is for humanitarian and development assistance, Mr. Speaker. I could not agree more with the member that all of us in the world needs to be vaccinated for all of us to be safe. Thank you.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, all Canadians want to see a leader who will work to heal rifts, not further divide. A leader who will listen, even to those voices he might not agree with. A leader who will work to understand, not dismiss, name call, and gaslight. Contrary to some, there are thousands of passionate, patriotic, and peaceful Canadians on the Hill right now who just want to be heard. Will the Prime Minister extend an olive branch, and will he listen?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I think we all support free speech in this House, but there's a big difference between free speech and inciting hatred, inciting violence, desecrating war memorials, Mr. Speaker. And I would hope my honourable colleague would denounce that in the clearest terms, Mr. Speaker. Those radical leaders are not really interested in free speech because they want to pretend as though vaccines don't work. On this side of the House, we know vaccines work. That's the gateway to freedom, and this government will do everything that we can to get there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Of course, we all condemn hateful and destructive acts by a few at any protest. Whether it's beheading the statue of Queen Victoria in Manitoba, tearing down the statue of Sir John A. in Montreal, or putting flags on Terry Fox, whether it's burning churches, whether it's wearing blackface, whether it's Hezbollah flags or Nazi flags, we all condemn it. But I'm not talking about that, Mr. Speaker.
You might want to stay down. You might want to stay down.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, let's be abundantly clear. that those individuals who've called for the incitement of violence to overthrow this government, who have caused significant disruption by flagrantly ignoring public health care measures that have forced shops and businesses to close, that have desecrated war memorials, are not interested in free speech, they're not interested in discourse, and they're certainly not interested in advancing our way out of this pandemic, Mr. Speaker. This government will always listen to those who want to have a robust debate about public health care measures, but we have to draw a bright line between those who are interested in that debate and those who are not.
For Portage-Lisgar.
Well, that minister is not telling the truth, and it's shameful to see what he is doing, accusing Canadians of being...
Order. I think both sides are very truthful in saying what they say. Whether they agree with it or not is something that is another story. But calling someone who's basically calling them a name or accusing them of something is not permitted in the House. I'll let the honourable member for Portage-Lisgar start from the top, and I'm sure she'll ask the question correctly.
Mr. Speaker, and I apologize that that minister is misleading Canadians. I do get very defensive of Canadians who are outside today, patriotic, peace-loving Canadians who are called misogynist and racist by the Prime Minister. So again, I will ask the Prime Minister, who, may I remind this House, wore blackface on more times than he can remember, apologize to the peace-loving, patriotic Canadians who are outside right now just asking to be heard. Will he speak to them?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this is a moment where we have to acknowledge that the protests that have occurred have made their point. And I would ask the member opposite to encourage the people that are outside to continue in a way that is peaceful, that moves beyond what we have seen. Ottawa is being paralyzed right now. We're seeing imagery that's not appropriate.
I'm going to ask the Honourable Minister to hold on for a second, because I'm sure the Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar wants to hear an answer to the question she asked. No, I'll let the Honourable Minister continue from where he left off.
I'll just say this, Mr. Speaker. I was in opposition. I was in opposition for about 7 years, and there were times where I was overheated in my rhetoric. There were moments where I got too carried away with what I believed passionately at the time. There is a moment where we need to de-escalate. There's a moment where we need to bring it down, and I'm asking the members opposite, instead of going outside with these protests, to...
The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are struggling. The cost of groceries are going up, gas and heating are getting more and more expensive, and the price of housing is soaring. In a recent poll, 60% of Canadians said they were having difficulty feeding their families. Liberals are not making it better for Canadians, especially vulnerable seniors who are being told that they must wait months longer for their GIS payment. When will this government help hardworking Canadians who are struggling every day just to get by?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the member opposite for her important question. And we absolutely appreciate that there are many Canadians, particularly vulnerable seniors, facing affordability challenges. In the fall economic update, we presented our government's plan to support those seniors with a one-time payment. We will be there for those seniors who need our support. And I want to thank and congratulate all the Canadians who are behind Canada's very robust economic recovery from the COVID recession.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the problem with that answer, just as the problem with the minister's announcement in the fall economic statement, is that it does not in any way do justice to the urgency of those seniors that have lost their home now because the government decided to claw back their guaranteed income supplement and aren't getting any relief. So they're out on the street, they're freezing in the cold. We've heard reports of people who have already lost their life. And the fact of the matter is that waiting until May isn't good enough. It's why we join with Campaign 2000 to call for an emergency payment for those people, and also to make sure that there's a fund to get them housed right away, not in May. So Wednesday.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think we can all agree just how challenging this pandemic has been on seniors, particularly those most vulnerable. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, we worked extremely hard to strengthen income security for seniors, including the increases to the GIS. That has helped over 900,000 low-income seniors, Mr. Speaker. We also know seniors who access income supports because they needed it during this crisis, and they shouldn't be penalized for it now. And that's why we're making a major investments through a one-time payment for those seniors affected. We've always been there for seniors, Mr. Speaker. We'll always continue to have their backs. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Mississauga-Malton.
Constituents in Mississauga-Malton are worried about the rising cost of housing. They want to see federal leadership to create more affordable housing. Unfortunately, while our government delivers that leadership through the National Housing Strategy, Conservative Party members continued to repeat disinformation about a non-existent home equity tax in right-wing media last week. Can the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion please set the record straight again in this House on the Conservative disinformation about a home equity tax?
Well, Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for Mississauga-Malton for his important question and his advocacy on affordable housing. And I want to welcome the opportunity to remind those spreading misinformation that our government is not considering charging capital gains or surtaxes on primary residences. And any suggestion otherwise, including from the Conservative Party, is absolutely false. So while they continue to make up claims, we will focus on making sure that each and every Canadian has access to a safe and affordable place to call home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Just because the Prime Minister dressed up in racist costumes so many times he can't remember them all doesn't mean every single Liberal is a racist. Just because the Prime Minister had tried to help a corporation avoid prosecution after it stole from some of Africa's poorest people doesn't mean all Liberals are racist. Just because about a half dozen Liberal MPs who are racial minorities have complained about his treatment of them does not mean that all Liberals are racist. That is guilt by association. Why doesn't the Prime Minister opt instead for personal responsibility?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that I've been clear in all of my comments, that I respect the honourable colleagues on the other side, just as I believe they respect the colleagues that are on this side and the work that we do and the people that we are. There are times in our political discourse where we see things that are abhorrent, and all I would ask is that we equally call it out. When I saw swastikas on the street, when I saw what had happened, it's time to move on. And what I would ask is, instead of trying to inflame the situation, let us de-escalate the situation. Let us work together to find a way to stop the lockdown that is happening of this city, so that citizens can move forward with their lives and any legitimate grievances can be fairly heard.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree. We should always call out evil symbols and the individuals who are individually responsible for putting them up. I remember a January 2018 event where the Prime Minister stared straight at a swastika and instead of condemning it, said, "Thank you for coming, sir." We on this side condemn evil symbols whenever they are used. I do respect that member. I just wish his government would respect the thousands of people who are fighting for their livelihoods right now, who are trying to do the best to get this country back on track.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
We are in a time of global crisis, a time when so many are being adversely affected by this pandemic, and our hearts go out to every one of them. The way in which we have discourse for each other will define this moment for all of us. And to those that are peacefully protesting, I would ask that their point has been made. It's time to go home and do it a different way. That continuing to lock down this city and continuing to do what's happening, it is deeply disturbing for Canadians to see the way that this city and our symbols are being treated. And I would ask the Conservatives to also join with us to ask that they go home, and let's do this responsibly. Let's have responsible dialogue. I respect the member opposite. Let's do this the right way.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, the problem is they've shown no respect for the people. This country right now is like a raw nerve, and the Prime Minister is jumping up and down on it again and again with his inflammatory rhetoric. We're talking about people who have 14-year-old kids that are suicidal after 2 years of lockdowns. I just spoke to a waitress whose business was wiped out by lockdowns. I'm talking to truckers who've been serving food on our plates throughout this, and these are the very people, honest, hardworking, shirt off your back type of people that this Prime Minister keeps attacking.
The Honourable Government House Leader. We'll wait to start the time. Okay, very good. Please go.
Mr. Speaker, again, I encourage the member to just think about as he's talking about de-escalating and having civil discourse, his tone and how he's approaching this issue. This is a time that is incredibly delicate. We are in a moment where there is a raw nerve that is being touched. How we talk to each other, Mr. Speaker, how we deal with one another.
I'm going to interrupt the Honourable Government House Leader and just wait till everything calms down a moment and then allow him to start from the top, because I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to hear it all, and I'm sure the Honourable Member from Carleton asked a question he wanted an answer to, and he wants to hear it, and we're just not hearing anything because of the noise. The Honourable Government House Leader, please proceed.
I have an instinct, and that instinct is that Canadians expect us today, when they're seeing what's happened over this weekend, to watch the dialogue in this chamber be as respectful as possible, for us to dial down our rhetoric and our language, for us to engage in one another and find an off-ramp from the escalation that has occurred, because this is not healthy. In a healthy democracy, we have respectful debates that don't involve some of the things that we've seen. And all I'm asking for is for us to engage in a constructive way. So if we could attempt in this place, in this hour, to be equal to that, I hope that we can move forward on that basis.
Well, member for Carleton.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And Mr. Speaker, I was out at an overpass as the truckers went by. And what I saw were cheerful, patriotic, optimistic Canadians who want their freedom back and want their livelihoods back. And they're standing up for their fellow Canadians, the 60% of families who fear they can't feed themselves. The 28-year-old kid living in mom's basement because he can't afford a home. The small businessman wiped out by endless lockdowns by incompetent politicians. These are the people that are standing up and fighting for their livelihoods and their freedom. Why won't the government finally stand with them?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I have a fundamental difference, and that is that I don't believe that my enemy is across the aisle. I believe that our enemy is this pandemic, and that our enemy is ending this pandemic and getting everybody to get vaccinated and to move forward in a way where the concerns that he's talking about, being affected by a global crisis, means that they are supported. This is a time of collective trauma. It requires us to be compassionate, to work with another, and understand that our common enemy is the virus and not one another.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Monsieur le Président, vendredi, ce sera la cérémonie d'ouverture des Jeux de Pékin. Le monde entier va célébrer la grandeur de la Chine au même moment où elle commet un génocide contre sa propre population, le peuple ouïghour. Monsieur le Président, il ne faut pas vouloir aux athlètes.
We should not blame the athletes. They are not the ones who decided to encourage the games to be held in China. It's this government. Can this government at least have the courage to finally recognize that what is happening in China is true and that the Uyghur people are being subject to genocide? The Honourable Minister of Sport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, which allows me to speak for the first time in this House, and thank the constituents of my riding. Mr. Speaker, the decision whether to participate in the Olympics or not in China was first and foremost up to the Olympic Committee and the Paralympic committees. Athletes in other countries as well have decided to send their athletes to participate in the Chinese Olympics. The government sent a clear and coherent message. We've always defended this. We are in favor of democracy, and that is why, in cooperation with our allies, we are not sending an official delegation to China. Mr. Speaker, it's curious. Canada is participating in a diplomatic boycott of the Games, but they're not even able to tell us
de nous dire que c'est parce que la Chine commet un génocide contre le peuple ouïghour.
China is
Ils
committing
veulent pas qu'on
genocide
enquête
against the Uyghur
là-dessus.
people.
Ils voulaient pas qu'on
They
retarde
don't
ou qu'on
want us
déplace les
to
jeux. Ils
investigate this.
acceptent
They
un
don't want us
boycott
to delay
diplomatique,
or
mais ils
move the
refusent de
games.
nous dire
They
pourquoi.
accepted
Est-ce que c'est
diplomatic
ça le rôle
boycott, but they
diplomatique du
refused to tell
Canada?
us why.
Monsieur le Président,
Is
c'est
this
ça
what
que le
the
Premier
Prime Minister
ministre
had
avait
in
en
mind
tête
when
quand
he
il disait au
told the
monde entier, là,
world
je vais le citer en anglais, quand il
that
disait au monde
Canada
entier, Canada is back.
back?
Est-ce que c'est ça qu'il voulait dire?
Is that what he meant by that?
L'honorable ministre des
The
Affaires
Honourable
étrangères.
Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Président, on prend très au
Mr.
sérieux les
Speaker,
allégations de
I
génocide
take
contre
the
le peuple
allegations
ouïghour
of
en Chine.
genocide in
Et c'est
China
pourquoi-
against the
et c'est
Uyghur
pourquoi
people
on a
very
toujours fait part
seriously,
de
and that
ces
is why
préoccupations-là. C'est
we've
pourquoi
always
aussi
shared these
on fait en sorte
concerns,
de pas
and that
envoyer
is
de
why
représentation
we have decided
politique
not to
aux Jeux
send
de
a
Pékin qui
diplomatic
commencent vendredi.
delegation
Mais
to
aussi, c'est
the
pourquoi
Olympic
on
Games
a
that start
demandé au Comité
Friday,
des
and
droits
that's
de
why
l'homme de
we
l'ONU
asked the
d'enquêter
Human
sur le
Rights
sujet.
Commission
Alors j'aimerais
at the
corriger mon
UN
collègue
to
à
investigate the
l'effet que l'on
situation.
fait
So I'd
pas
like
preuve
to
de
correct
leadership
my
ni que l'on
colleague.
fait pas enquête sur la question. Au
Because
contraire, on
when he
veut
says
faire
that we
en
won't
sorte
investigate it,
justement
that's
faire
not
toute
true.
la
On the
lumière
contrary,
sur cette
we want to
question
shed
parce que
full
c'est
light on this
extrêmement
issue because
préoccupant.
it's
Merci,
very
Monsieur le
concerning. Thank you very
Member
much.
for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, last month the Associate Finance Minister said that when it came to payroll tax hikes, that, quote, businesses can afford this. How completely out of touch is this comment with small businesses, considering they went ahead with these tax hikes despite 30-year record high inflation rates? We have to assume this government believes that businesses can afford these as well. So to the minister, how historically high do inflation rates have to be before this government stops increasing taxes on small businesses?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to supporting small businesses, it is a bit rich of the Conservatives to presume to offer our government any advice at all. After all, before Christmas, when the Omicron wave was rising, it was these Conservatives who opposed Bill C-2, a bill which included a lockdown insurance policy for small businesses and Canadians. The Conservatives voted against it. Thank goodness they failed. Otherwise, our small businesses today would have no support.
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, record inflation, coupled with this government's brutal GIS clawback, has financially crippled many of Canada's hardworking seniors. Forced to spend their golden years in the labour market just to make ends meet. Our vulnerable seniors need to know that Ottawa is listening. That is why our Conservative opposition called on this government to reverse the CPP tax hike. Mr. Speaker, when will this government stand up, rise up, lean in to Canada's hardworking seniors and help them meet their basic...
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, seniors have worked all their lives and they deserve to feel safe and financially secure later in their life. That is why, Mr. Speaker, our government is delivering on our promise to increase the OAS by 10% for those 75 and older, strengthening the support for all Canadians later in life. Since 2015, Mr. Speaker, we have restored the age of eligibility for OAS to 65. We have increased the GIS for single seniors and strengthened the CPP. During the pandemic, we provided direct and immediate support for seniors, Mr. Speaker, and as always, we will be there for them.
The Honourable Member for Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, with inflation reaching a 30-year high, the government continues to hurt Canadians with its poor economic policies. Nearly 60% of people are finding it difficult to feed their families. And if that's not bad enough, the government raised its CPP tax on Canadians, an extra $700 coming out of families' paychecks. Now, this may mean nothing to this Prime Minister, but it matters to everybody else. When will the government reverse its CPP tax and stop penalizing hardworking families?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives continue to irresponsibly perpetuate a false economic narrative and talk down the Canadian economy. The reality is that Canada is resilient and and our economy is robustly recovering from the COVID recession. In Q3, our GDP grew by 5.4%. That was beating the US, Japan, the UK, and Australia. We have recovered 108% of jobs lost to the pandemic, compared to just 84% in the US. And we had, in November, a trade surplus at a 13-year high, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings Hants.
Mr. Speaker, in December, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change announced a consultation process on our new climate commitments. The Minister also confirmed that he will table, by the end of March 2022, Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan. Can the Minister inform this House on how our government will build a strong foundation to achieve net zero by 2050?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to congratulate my colleague for his ongoing efforts to speak French in this House, and our government in the past few years has invested billions in climate change efforts, and there will be many new components in our new legislation, including zero-emission efforts, as well as a ceiling on GES emissions.
The honourable member for King Vaughan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many in Canada's labour force are senior citizens, struggling to get by. Many seniors are forced to work beyond the retirement age, to no fault of their own. The CPP tax hike is added insult to injury to our seniors who have worked hard their whole life. The out-of-control inflation has many working seniors feeling like retirement is a dream they will never have the ability to experience. When will this government reverse the CPP hikes for our seniors? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, since 2015, our government has been strengthening retirement support for seniors today and for future retirees. We have built a strong social net and pension system that all Canadians, Mr. Speaker, can be proud of. We have enhanced the CPP, the OAS, and raised GIS for single seniors. That has helped 900,000 low-income single seniors, Mr. Speaker. We're helping investing in services such as $70 million for New Horizons for Seniors program, billions into home care, Mr. Speaker. We're going to make sure that seniors now and into the future have all the supports that they need. Thank you.
Member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Mr. Speaker, CMHC is a federal agency funded by this housing minister using taxpayer dollars. So recently, CMHC funds a study that determined the best course of action: tax Canadian homeowners more. Now, why should Canadians be concerned about this, Mr. Speaker? Because this government continues to float the idea of adding more taxes on Canadian homeowners. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we are 100% against this tax. Why does this minister continue to support the idea of adding more taxes on Canadian homeowners?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
It gives me another opportunity to once again state categorically that our government is not considering charging capital gains or surge taxes on primary residences. We've said this time and time again in the House of Commons and in the public sphere. And the party opposite continues to engage in misinformation. We're busy focused on the work of ensuring that each and every Canadian has a safe and affordable place to call home.
L'honorable député de Port-Neuf-Jacques-Cartier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On veut que nos entreprises croient en l'avenir de notre pays, qu'ils investissent et continuent d'exploiter leur commerce. Des programmes ont été mis sur pied pour aider nos entrepreneurs pendant cette crise. Mais il y en a qui n'ont pas accès à cette aide financière car ils ont ouvert leur entreprise en 2020. Ils participent à la relance économique, mais rien n'est prévu pour eux. Qu'entend faire la ministre des Finances pour soutenir des entrepreneurs et sauver leur entreprise?
And save their businesses.
L'honorable vice-première ministre.
Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, I have to stress the hypocrisy of the Conservative Party. We know, well, in terms of small businesses in Canada, we saw the rise in the Omicron wave, and we established measures to help and support small businesses in Canada. The Conservatives were against such measures. I'm very happy to be able to help small businesses, and our government was able to support them against.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, we know that the vaccine is the best way to end this pandemic and to ensure the security of our communities.
Can the Minister of Transport please share with the House the steps our government is taking to safeguard the health of Canadians and Canada's air transportation system? Thank you.
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her question. Our government is committed to the public health of our citizens. Mr. Speaker, our leadership requires belief in science. Leadership also requires resolve, and we are resolute to doing everything we can to protect the health and safety of Canadians. That's why we've implemented measures, including requiring travellers to be fully vaccinated, and any allegations of violations of our public health measures will be investigated fully by Transport Canada, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, like many other frontline workers, grocery store workers have put their health at risk to make sure Canadians have been able to get the essentials that they need. With COVID-19 cases high, it's absolutely essential that they are treated and compensated fairly for the work that they do. Big grocery store chains won't do the right thing on their own and restore the hero pay they had promised. They even take government handouts to pay their rich CEOs. If the Liberals won't stand up for these workers, will they at least guarantee that these fat cats won't continue to get taxpayer subsidized money, especially when they promise to make this happen? What will the minister do?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the member opposite for reminding us yet again that COVID has really shown us who are the truly essential workers in our economy, and that very much includes frontline workers in places like grocery stores. Our government is very pleased to have been able to put measures in place throughout COVID to support these workers, including measures like paid sick leave, including measures like government support for people who need to take time off if a loved one is sick, and of course the increase in the Canada Workers Benefit.
Absolutely. The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, over 400 climate scientists and scholars co-signed a letter calling on the federal government to step back from its plan to introduce another fossil fuel subsidy, a new tax credit for carbon capture and storage. As stated in their letter, despite decades of research, carbon capture is neither economically sound nor proven at scale. This proposal would only divert resources away from proven and cost-effective solutions like renewable energy and electrification. Can the minister confirm they will listen to scientists and scrap this proposed new subsidy?
The Honourable Minister. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for his question. We have to look at every possible technologies that will help us reduce greenhouse gas, and in fact, when it comes to carbon capture and storage, the IPCC itself produced a report a few years ago looking at this very technology, saying that we might have to do it because we won't be able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions fast enough to prevent 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui pour la période de questions.
That's all the time we have for question period today.
Did you have a... No? Okay. Good. No point of order.